Hi, welcome to, I think it's session 12 of the Westminster Confession of Faith. We have been recording these live and posting them the next day. Last couple of times, something's gone wrong, different things both times, and it hasn't worked. So I know some of you do follow up on these, so I thought I'd record them. We missed some of your good questions and some interaction, and this isn't quite as fresh in my mind, but as well as taking me back to horrible memories of lockdown when a lot of stuff was broadcast from where I'm sat now. Anyway, we're on session 12, chapter 5. We're going a little bit faster now through the Confession of Faith. The other ones, the early ones, involved a bit more going over slowly, a bit more depth there. We can pick up the pace a little bit, and we're thinking about providence. So I'm going to read to you paragraph 1, and then we'll tuck in. So WCF 5.1. God, the creator of all things, does uphold, direct, dispose, and govern all creatures, actions, and things, from the greatest even to the least, by his most wise and holy providence, according to his infallible knowledge, and the free and immutable counsel of his own will, to the praise of his glory and of his power, of his wisdom, power, justice, goodness, and mercy. So far, and I said we went a bit slower to start with, we looked at chapter 1, the Bible. How do we know? What do we know about God, and among other things? Chapter 2 was about God. What do we mean by God? And we thought a bit about the Trinity. Chapter 3 was about his decree, and we summed that up by saying God has the whole world in his hands. That's what God's decree is about. He decrees all things to come to pass, and that works out specifically in a couple of ways. The first of those was chapter 4, creation, and the other way we're looking at now, chapter 5, providence. That is how God arranges all things. So the extent of that means that it says in these words, all creatures, actions, and things. So that's from the greatest even to the very least. And so the divines have given us some cross-references, and those ones include examples from the Bible about rulers and nations, the weather, animals, our health, all things. But also all things in goodness and wisdom from the midpoint onwards. It says that he is wise and has foreknowledge. So we've thought about this before. It would be scary to have the amount, to any being in the universe with the power and the knowledge and foreknowledge that God has. But it's used always and only in ways that are good, wise, and holy. And the purpose and the end of this providence is, it says, to the glory of God's providence. In other words, providence leads to God's praise and glory, because what he does ultimately is always good. So it's never spiteful or random or capricious. Now, when we were meeting in Hall Street, I did this, I asked a question. Well, I'll ask it to you anyway, and you can pause on YouTube and ponder and think about this. And if there's a couple of you, you can discuss it together. So far, why is this good for us? Why is this good for us? Pause and ponder. Okay, obviously I can't get any feedback, but 5.2. Although in relation to the foreknowledge and decree of God, the first cause, all things come to pass immutably and infallibly, yet by the same providence he orders them to fall out according to the nature of second causes, either necessary, freely, or contingently, we might say circumstantially. We'll come back to that in a moment. It sounds a little bit deeper. If you've got a copy in front of you or Google it, that would be helpful when we come back to that. And then 5.3, it relates very tightly. 5.3, God in his ordinary providence makes use of means, yet is free to work without, above, and against them at his pleasure. Now 5.2 sounded a little bit heavy to start with, but the point it's making is far less so. So by first cause, what they mean is that God is the first cause. God is the executioner of his own will. So an example is in Acts 2:23. God decreed the capture and the execution of Jesus for his own purpose. So God is the first cause. God wanted that to happen. It happened. Second clause is how God executes his will. So he could just do things, but he tends to use secondary causes. So he used people that arrested Jesus and nailed him to a cross, for example. And those appear to us as what they describe as necessary, free, or contingent. Now, if you go to the cross references they give and look at the examples, they will explain what they mean. And I'll give you the examples. So, necessary. Jeremiah 31:35, the sun and the moon and the laws of nature are needed for things to work. Free. So, example he gives is Exodus and Deuteronomy. It talks about the cities of refuge, and the point here is for the provision for the defense of a man who's slaughtered, accidental killing, that sort of thing. And so someone is free to take out that provision. They're free to make the choice to walk there. It's up to them or not to do that. Now, God is the first cause, but it's someone's will and how they execute their actions. And contingent, they give the example of 1 Kings 22, where Micaiah the prophet talks about Ahab. And there are certain outcomes contingent on other events. So if this happens, then this will happen, then this will happen. So God has decreed what will happen, but there are certain contingent things that bring that about. Now, don't worry about all that detail. About remembering that. The point is, God gets done what he wants to get done. What God wants to happen will happen. And he tends not to directly work through miracles, but laws of science, our choices, and outcomes of other events he uses to bring about his purposes. So that's 5.2. 5.3, we're introduced to a very Presbyterian word, ordinary. There's a number of things that I've always believed, or for a long time at least. But the Presbyterians often use this word ordinary. So God could do other things, but ordinarily he does this. So God tends to use ordinary means, whether it's how crops grow through rain and sunshine, or how the preaching of the gospel grows the church. But he can suspend or extend to do something extraordinary. In fact, he can even work against those ordinary means. And the examples that they give in the footnotes are Sarah's pregnancy. She's a very old lady, and Abraham's a very old man. And so it goes beyond the normal natural course of things. Samson's strength, an axe head floating, and so on. God tends to use ordinary things, but he's not limited to ordinary things. So again, you can pause in a moment and ponder this question. How do we expect God to work? Well, have a think about that. Pause. And if you're back with us, 5.4, the almighty power, unsearchable wisdom, and infinite goodness of God so far manifest themselves in his providence that it extend itself even to the first fall and other sins of angels and men, and that not by a bare or mere permission, but such as has joined it a most wise and powerful bonding, and otherwise ordering and governing of them in a manifold dispensation, we might say varied administration, to his own holy ends. Yet so as the sinfulness thereof proceeds only from the creature and not from God, not being only most holy and righteous, neither is nor can be the author or approver of sin. Now this is pretty involved, but here's the headline point. God authors all deeds, but he's not guilty of sin or the author, far less the approver of them. So God permits it whilst limiting it and using it to good ends. For example, in Genesis, we hear about Joseph and his brothers. And Joseph says to his brothers, you meant this for evil. They meant Joseph harm, but God used that for good. And Joseph recognizes that. But they can't use that and say, well, God used it for good. And so, we're excused of any evil and any consequences that are brought about. So you can't do that. but God still used that. So a few cross references here. James 1:14. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. Now in the next chapter, we'll actually think a bit more about how that works. 1:16, so 1 John 2:16. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes, the pride in possessions, is not from the Father, but from the world. So what they're saying is, you can't blame God. Sin is from us. He may use the sin in us, but the sin does not originate with God. Now, how does that all square? Well, that's for another time. And there is a mysterious element to this where we can articulate, we can describe what the situation is, but we can't understand everything that's behind it. So, three more. A couple of these are bigger. So 5.5. The most wise, righteous, and gracious God does often leave for a season his own children to manifold temptations and the corruption of their own hearts, to chastise them for their former sins, or to discover unto them the hidden strength of corruption and deceitfulness of their hearts, that they may be humbled, and to raise them to a more close and constant dependence for their support upon himself, and to make them more watchful against all future occasions of sin, and for sundry other just and holy ends. 5.6. As for those wicked and ungodly men, whom God, as a righteous judge for former sins, does blind and harden them, from them he not only withholds his grace, whereby they might have been enlightened in their understandings, or wrought upon in their hearts, but sometimes also withdraws the gifts which they had, and exposes them to such objects as their corruption makes occasions of sins, and in addition gives them over to their own lusts and temptations of the world and the power of Satan, whereby it comes to pass that they harden themselves even under those means which God uses for the softening of others. And finally, 5.7. As the providence of God does, in general, reach to all creatures, so after a most special manner it takes care of his church and disposes all things to the good thereof. So last three paragraphs are quite pastoral, particularly 5.5 is very pastoral. So there's a question here, why is the most wise and good God allowing sin and suffering? And why is it that the one who does not tempt leaves us to temptation, and so on? And you could say he uses bad for sometimes, he can use bad for good and good for evil. So he uses bad for good. So he uses bad sometimes to mature and grow us and develop us and humble us, sometimes to discipline us, and it makes us more dependent on him, is what they're saying. And he uses good for evil. So God can withhold good, and he can withhold grace because they're his. And so he uses words very similar to Romans 1, that sometimes God hands over people for a time or permanently to their sin. We see that, for example, in Pharaoh. He hands Pharaoh over. And there's various other examples of how God allows people to continue down a trajectory to heighten their sin. And so he uses providence to wake up the saints, but also that same providence, that same thing that wakes up some people, compounds sinners in their sinful and anti-God decisions. But with the church, it talks about all providence. God's providence extends to all people and all things, but especially for the health of his church. So his providence affects where everybody is, anytime and anything, but particularly for the good outcomes of his people, the church. So, for example, 1 Timothy 4:10, for to this end we toil and strive, because we have our hope set on the living God, who is the Saviour of all people, especially to those who believe. Romans 8:28, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. And it's not just a general good. He goes on in that chapter, so before it talks about suffering and all kinds of things that go wrong, but but where does it land? To live out so we become conformed to the likeness of Jesus Christ. And in the footnotes, the quotes from Isaiah, you're talking about the exile, ancient Near Eastern history, and bad things that happen to Israel through all that, all work out to the good of Israel and God's people. So you may hear people say all things happen for a reason. Now, anyone who says that is either really silly and naive or profound and mature. I know some people react very strongly against all things happen for a reason, perhaps because it's used in a twee way. I remember doing a funeral for a baby, and there was a car near where the funeral happened, and it had on it Jesus is Lord, and obviously it was quite an emotional time. And I thought that person is either has no idea about how the real world pans out, or they've really got it. So that is chapter 5 on Providence. So where we ended when we did this live and for real is that we had a discussion about what comforts does that bring. So make yourself a cup of coffee, or perhaps chat with a Christian friend and say, this stuff about Providence, how does that comfort me?